Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining today's webinar. My name is Jay Doran, and I'm with the Legal Foundation of Washington. And today's webinar is how to ethically and effectively tell client stories. I am just going to go over introductions and a few housekeeping items, and then we'll begin with the presentation. So first, for credits. This seminar has been approved for 1.5 other credits for Washington attorneys, and for those folks, for Washington attorneys, WSBA CLE will report your credit hours within 30 days of this seminar, and they'll use the information that you provided to log into this webinar to serve as your sign-in for CLE credit. The second thing is how to interact with us online today. So there are a couple different options. You can use, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a menu that says Q&A. You can click on Q&A and submit a question, which will come to me as the moderator. And I'll be able to respond either directly or to the group. You can also chat in the chat box, which should be on the right side of your screen. There is going to be about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the webinar for a Q&A. So I'm going to be looking at questions as they come in. If the question is substantive, I'm likely just going to hang on to it until we get to the Q&A section. If it has to do with a tech issue, I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can. And lastly, the third housekeeping item is about feedback. So your input is really important to us about this webinar and how our presenters have done. So please make sure to complete the online survey. You'll be emailed a link following this webinar, and it's just a short survey monkey to give us feedback and let us know how we can improve. So that's it for housekeeping. Before I turn it over to our presenters, just some really short introductions. We're joined today by Aparna Ray, Ashley Archibald, and Jordan Melograna. Aparna has worked with nonprofits, grassroots NGOs, startups, and government institutions at the intersection of diversity, equity, inclusion, and program strategy, evaluation, and organizational design. In 2013, she co-founded Project Feast, placing immigrant and refugee women on a path to employment. And in 2015, she launched a pan-Indian India blend learning platform via Teach for India. She currently is supporting the design and launch of Panorama Global's Future of Work initiative. And you have her contact information and more information about her in your webinar materials. Ashley is a media professional with a degree from the London School of Economics and Political Science with a master's in local economic development. She currently works as a staff reporter for Real Change, which is an award-winning weekly newspaper that provides immediate employment opportunity and takes action for economic, social, and racial justice here in Seattle. And Jordan has been producing creative content for nonprofits, companies, and campaigns for the last decade, with a focus on visual storytelling that advocates for human rights. Jordan is a graduate of the Filmmaking School at the University of North Carolina and is currently pursuing his master's at the University of Washington's Communication Leadership Program. As program director, Jordan leads the creative production of Rooted in Rights content, gives presentations and trainings on video advocacy, specifically for rights organizations, and continues to shoot and edit original videos. So those are your three presenters today, and like I said, make sure to hold on to your questions because we will have time at the end for a short Q&A. Thank you.
Awesome. Hi, everybody. My name is Aparna, and I'm so excited to have everybody joining the webinar today. I want to start the conversation and lay the groundwork for why it's important to tell stories in a way that is ethical and that honors the client of legal aid organizations. It's 2018, and all of us find ourselves looking at discriminatory practices that affect communities of color and low-income populations across the state of Washington, and legal aid organizations across the state serve a really valuable purpose in ensuring that there is access to equitable representation to all people. We know that 7 out of 10 low-income households in the state come up with a legal challenge on a yearly basis that requires representation. And the work that all of you do is critical in ensuring that they're represented. We know that there has been both growth in funding of legal aid organizations and growth in the number of legal aid organizations across the state over the past decade, and yet there are challenges that persist in organizations in how we tell stories. Often we are telling stories to carve out a niche in a really crowded media landscape, and it's important that as we make space for our organizations collectively, that we tell stories in a manner that is truly ethical and does not affirm the inequities that we are charged with addressing. So I want, if folks have access on your computers, to take a moment and grab the ATG State Plan. A link to that is included in your webinar materials as well. In 2018, ATJ has laid out a pretty comprehensive state plan to coordinate efforts among the various legal aid organizations, and the organization notes that closing the justice gap will require major investments to double the number of state-funded attorneys and also work in a manner that is coordinated in terms of delivery of services to clients. I would love to point everybody's attention to the framework in ATJ's state plan. It's right on the front page, and it looks at 5 key goals. And you will notice that race equity is right at the center of the state plan. It's the first goal, and it's a goal that actually enables the rest of the goals to work. Today we're going to talk really specifically about Goal 4, which is developing and increasing holistic client-centered services. ATJ's recommendation really begins with a desire to ensure racial equity and work within organizations and understand the role of implicit and explicit bias and racism when it comes to determining access to legal support. And because of the sensitive nature of legal aid work, it's really, really crucial that we understand the role of diversity, equity, and inclusion across all areas of our work. So we're going to take a really quick poll. Our group is really curious to know, in terms of who's joining the webinar today, who are you and what is your story? So take a moment and tell us a little bit about what your role is within the organization. Are you an attorney? Do you work on the program side? Are you part of the intake team? Do you work in communications and outreach? Or do you have a different role?
And just a reminder for folks, you need to respond actually on the slide itself, not in the Q&A or the group chat.
Awesome. Well, today we have 70% of our attendees as attorneys. So thanks, you guys, to have this really critical conversation with us. So as attorneys, I'm actually going to go back to an earlier slide. When you think about your role in your organization, what is the story that you tell others? And what is the story that you tell about your clients? Is it about being victims or survivors? Are you a hero? Or are you the villain in the situation? Do you think of yourself as a rescuer? How often are you thinking of the people that you're supporting as people in distress? So we have a second poll, and I'm going to push that now. So take a minute and tell us about how you describe yourself in your work with clients. Alrighty, just take one last second to take the poll and then we'll see the responses. All right, so we're looking at the poll results, and a really big mix of responses. The bulk of you say that you see yourself as rescuers, and I think, often that is how we perceive our roles when we are working with low-income populations, people that have legal challenges. For most of us, we have identified as all of these. For some of us, we identify as none of these options. The reason that we did this poll is to just say that, every person's story, every person's identity is unique. But one of the narratives that's really persistent across the work of nonprofit organizations is one of despair for clients and with nonprofits rolling in to save the day. And so our poll falls right in line with a lot of the assumptions that we see portrayed in media. So my question really is to all of us is, how do we do right by our clients while being able to tell a really great story of impact? And so one of the things that I'm going to share with you all today is the role of diversity, equity, and inclusion in legal aid organization storytelling. What I always say in working with any person, any organization is an equity lens is not something that lives in any one vertical of an organization, but instead it cuts across all aspects of our organization's work, everything from fund development to operations, program strategy, evaluation, and for legal aid organizations, how we work with our clients and how we choose to share their stories. Storytelling is the way in which we touch lives both in and out of our organizations, and it's one of the most important places for an equity lens. So I would love to offer with you all a framework that I've developed with colleagues in the impact sector. And it's one that recognizes that our work is continually growing, it's moving, it's shifting, and that we can always move from a place of being less impactful to a place of being the most impactful. And our work is never done, so I'm sharing this as a framework, and we can take from it, what works for all of us in this instance. You'll notice that at one end of the spectrum is storytelling that is perhaps more catchy in the short term, but much less impactful in the long run because it's pulling on just a single element, such as gender or race. And on the other end of the spectrum, you'll notice we have words like intersectionality. So true intersectionality demands that we take a really deep look at the inequities in the world and the world that our clients live in, which often may not be the same as the world that we live in, different set of circumstances, different access to resources. And so asking ourselves, what are the system of inequities that work against our clients, and inviting our clients to share authentically about their needs as a starting point in storytelling and in building programs that center them rather than centering our assumptions about what they need. This slide is in the webinar handouts as well, so I invite you to dig in and use that to ask questions. All right. So how do we shift? How do we make the changes that are really, really essential to being effective? So I'm offering 3 points. There can be more than 3, or there's one that will really deeply resonate with you. ATJ asks, do alliance organizations reflect the diversity of communities we serve at all levels? So ATJ's framework, the state plan's asking some really, really powerful questions in addition to the 3 points that I have listed. Starting with, are we developing really powerful questions, and are we asking the right questions? Is it about addressing poverty? Is it about shifting inequity? Or is it simply about helping somebody in the moment? The second one is, do we have inside all of our organizations adaptive processes that incorporate learnings from the ground? Like, what are we hearing from clients? What are we hearing from other organizations? And then are we adaptive to bring those learnings to bear on our communication strategy? And are we doing refreshes on that on a pretty regular basis so that it reflects our political climate, it reflects our regional landscape, and most importantly, it reflects the client stories. And then finally, our next set of presenters is going to go more in depth into what credible data collection looks like, but, how do we ensure fidelity when we look at client data and client stories? So in doing this work, I'm going to offer 3 suggestions, and I am drawing really heavily from the ATG State Plan and making connections between the work that you all do as attorneys and intake managers and client storytelling. So at the very base level, do we have shared values? And the state plan provides language and goals that we can all use to ensure that no matter which organization you work on behalf of, that we have the same set of values when it comes to representing clients, and those values are centered on racial equity. The second piece is, within your organizations, is there shared fluency of language? And are you working with your organization's leadership? That might include your board, your managers and directors, and doing the kind of equity-focused training and staff development so that, we actually put the values into practice and we put the values into our language, and we have a way to understand our own implicit biases that come into play when we are trying to work with clients who often come from very different cultures than we do. And when we're able to do those 2 things, we're able to tell really inclusive stories about our clients. So I'm going to leave you with the questions that we began with, which is, how would you tell the story? How would you tell your story, and how would you tell your clients' stories? Do you still see yourself as a rescuer or a villain or a survivor? This is a rhetorical question. We don't have another poll, and I'm going to hand off to my colleague, Ashley, from Real Change.
Hi, everybody. Excuse me. My name is Ashley Archibald. I'm a reporter with Real Change News. For those of you who may not be as familiar with the organization, it's a 24-year-old nonprofit newspaper that is purchased by generally, but not exclusively, homeless and low-income folks. They can then sell for additional income and also for, quite frankly, the the dignity of work, but that's not really an emphasis so much as just the ability to have a community that they can always come back to. So I just want to give you guys a little bit of information about, first of all, what our approach is to telling stories, because our vendors do tend to be vulnerable people, but we also are an organization that is working very hard to operate at the intersection of race and class and tell social justice stories. So if we're not telling stories about people experiencing homelessness, we may be talking about other folks that are marginalized or otherwise experiencing oppressions. And we have to be very careful about how we do that so that it's done in a responsible manner that doesn't further injure or traumatize the people that we're talking about. So I guess, first of all, there are a number of reasons that we write news articles, and I kind of lay them out a bit in this slide. I mean, usually we're trying to make change. We're trying to present information so that people know that there's a problem if they aren't themselves experiencing it, and then giving them some solutions and sort of areas that they can look at and push on if they want to be able to make an impact themselves. I wish personally, as a dorky human being, that data was enough to change people's minds, but it's not. I can show you 6 ways from Sunday where things are broken and wrong in our systems, but really people don't grok that until they can see a person's face and hear their story and how it's impacting them as a human being. And sort of to put a finer point on that, we don't want to write stories about broken people. People are not broken. Systems may injure them, and it is the systems that we can fix. And the people who are most negatively impacted by these systems can certainly band together and push back, but really the people who need to be working to make the change are the ones who aren't experiencing those oppressions. They need to be encouraged and given the information to go and fix them themselves. And that's an image from the March for Our Lives, where a whole bunch of really incredible high school students and supporters came out and said, hey, maybe we don't want people to die by gun violence. So that's the image, but then there's a lot of other work that has to happen, and that's hopefully things that are getting addressed in journalism to fix some of these very critical problems in our culture and society. It is very easy to get this wrong. Whether you have good intentions and really, you're really working on trying to do the right thing, it's still very easy to get it wrong. So these are some recent articles. I have not given any explicit information about where they come from, but they all characterize mostly poor people as in negative lights. They show one possible lens on them. In most cases, they really didn't talk to people who are experiencing homelessness. They didn't talk to people outside of that King County courthouse that I'm sure many of us have walked by. And instead, they, really bore down and said, well, the animals have taken over the streets. It's this is not how I would suggest doing storytelling. Here are some really positive ways. So they are stories in which people went out and they dug deep and they found information and data, and then they talked to people who were close to, on the left-hand side of the screen, there was a gentleman who actually died while experiencing homelessness. They found his sister. They put a light on him. They showed you his life. And that's really critical because people shouldn't, I think most of us would agree, people shouldn't be dying on the streets. We can make an impact there, but unless we see, if we other this person, then we're doing probably more harm than good. And this is one of our amazing vendors, Lisa Sawyer. I believe, I could be wrong, she's in Yakima right now, fighting the good fight and really pushing her story out there. And I included this slide mostly to say that it's not always, maybe even best for someone like me to write about Lisa, when Lisa can tell the story in her words. She's part of our Homeless Speakers Bureau, so you can actually hire her to go and talk about herself if you ever want to. So I think that the reason I put this slide in is that if you look at the handout, I kind of buried the lead on it, to be honest. Any story that we tell has to, this is a fundamental question that has to be asked. The answer to this question has to be yes. Otherwise, there is no real point. So that first set of stories, I talked about how these stories are being told about people, and it gets shared. Like, we see people taking these stories and these really negative perceptions, in this case of people experiencing homelessness that could be put into tiny houses and their situations bettered, and really reducing them to the most terrible negative stereotypes that exist about them. And that turns into propaganda, and it really catches fire, especially these days on the internet. Facebook is a positive thing in some ways. It also allows for stuff like this to become a really loud narrative, especially among people who apparently can show up to council meetings at 2 p.m. in the afternoon. So really well-intentioned people can cause harm too. Those are extreme examples, and I do realize that. But when it gets right down to it, you have to realize that when we're talking about people, most of our clients, or sort of the people that I'm talking to for stories, people are having the worst moment in their lives, and we can't reduce them to that. We have to show them as complete human beings, because it's difficult for other people to relate to them if they can say, oh, that could never be me. When we know, I think, again, based on data, that it absolutely could, very easily. And so when we write these stories and when we, show people, we have to show people in their full light. So this is a really simple framework that I kind of like to use when I'm going through and talking about, I guess, first why I want to do a story, and then how I can do it in the most responsible way. There are more questions on the handout that's included, but these are kind of the really basic ones. So again, does this serve the public good? Who is the best person to tell this story? You don't want to, I love talking to providers, do not get me wrong, but I always want to talk to somebody who has experienced the oppression or negative set of circumstances that we're trying to address, so that, again, we can put a face on it and we can really drive the point home why people should care. What story are we trying to tell? What considerations do we need to take to tell that story responsibly? Are they victims of domestic violence? Do we need to worry about, shielding their name from things? What kind of details should we include, and what should we really not include to best make sure that we're being respectful of the person that we're talking to? And that includes kind of settings. Where are we going to talk to them? Are we talking to them at home, at a shelter? Do we need a private setting? What makes them the most comfortable? And then also just to be respectful of other people's times. It's remarkably difficult to keep appointments when your entire life is just trying to get connected to services, as many of you know. So we just want to be patient and understanding with folks. So this part of it is really just how to make sure if you have a story that you want to pitch to an organization like Real Change or the Seattle Times or The Stranger, here's just some really quick tips on how to do it. So first, you want to look at the tone and past coverage of a publication that you're pitching if you're pitching them for the first time. Obviously, some groups they have just a very different writing style and very different capacity to tell stories. So The Stranger, you may know, has gone to a biweekly format. They're still doing daily news, doing really amazing daily news. So which writers you want to pitch are going to kind of vary based on what end of their publication you're trying to get in on. Is this an immediate story? Is this a feature story? And then you want to find the reporter that's doing the right kind of journalism. You want to find the beat reporter that is most appropriate. DOS attacks, a denial of service attack is when you hit a same computer with a whole bunch of requests and you crash it. You can crash a journalist too. Especially for daily journalists who have inboxes that are going crazy and overflowing, getting repeated pitches isn't always the best technique. You really, again, want to center and find the journalist that can do this best because that's their area. There are also, of course, assignment editors. You want to look at the organization chart if you can and try to find the best person to pitch that story to. Sell your product. Why should the public care about this particular circumstance or story? And why do you feel that you need to know? And also, I mean, if you want your story out there, make it as easy for the reporter to get in on as they can. Is there someone available to talk to them immediately? And it's really just good to try to facilitate their job if you want to use their platform. And that's especially true, again, with especially larger organizations. They're going to do more work. They're going to find more people. But if you give them that it's going to make your life and their life just so much easier.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I'm Jordan Melograna from Rooted in Rights. I really enjoyed Aparna and Ashley's portions of the event today, and they lead in quite nicely to what I'm about to talk about. Before I jump in, I should tell you a little bit about who we are and what we do, because you may not have heard of us. Rooted in Rights is a program based at Disability Rights Washington, which is the protection and advocacy organization for Washington State. We are located in downtown Seattle. And unlike some of the other programs at DRW, which are legal advocacy or policy advocacy programs, we're unique in that we do just video and social media storytelling. And we do this sometimes in support of the legal advocacy that goes on here in the state, but often we are also speaking to national audiences, either as part of campaigns or as original productions that we put out almost exclusively through social media. We take into consideration a lot of what's been talked about today, but one of the things that I think we do best is we have developed a series in which we hand over the tools of storytelling, and we call that the Rooted in Rights Storyteller Series. How that works is, in the past, we've recruited people, but nowadays we call for submissions for really anyone in the world with a disability who has a story to tell can apply. If they get in, they're voted on by our social media audiences, and we work with them over a period of a few weeks to write and direct and many times, the first video they've ever made. The videos are about personal stories connected to larger systemic issues. We've been doing this now for about 2 years and have about 12.5 storyteller videos so far, and we just started our next round. So why am I part of this panel? Well, I think our approach can be helpful to you, even if most of you will never make a video or do a communication creative piece like this, because our approach, our programmatic approach, can be applied, I think, outside of video storytelling. So let me also start why we did this series in the first place. We, as Rooted in Rights, rely completely on providing authentic stories from around the world. That is our bread and butter. That is why people follow us. That is why people are engaged with us. So having access to authentic, unique stories that no one has ever been told before, is really important to our existence. And so we wanted to find a way to go out into the world in an effective way, knowing that we only have 8 or 9 people on staff here in the United States. The official motto of the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us. And that motto has made a huge impact on me personally, and I think on our program. And the Storyteller Series is quite literally that. We are not going to make stories about people with disabilities without people with disabilities involved, or in this case, actually leading the project itself. As I mentioned before, we, in addition to some of the work we do in which it's a more traditional sort of documentary style where professional filmmakers go out and talk with folks, we wanted a way in which to hand those tools over to the affected population rather than just making the stories about them. And these days, because mobile technology has allowed anyone really to start making videos, we thought this was the perfect moment in history technologically to be able to do that. And in fact, the Storyteller Series is shot entirely on mobile devices. And then another goal that has developed more and more over time is that we want to see more disabled people in front of and behind the camera. And we mean that in every way possible. That could be a YouTube series, that could be a feature film, that could be TV, that could be marketing. We want more of our population in those jobs controlling the narrative and in front of the camera. And so we found the series to be an excellent starting point for people who want to get their feet wet, who want to try it out for the first time, gain some skills, create a portfolio piece, and hopefully move on to either educational opportunities or employment opportunities in some of those fields. So how we think about this, and the way this really works well, is that we have grassroots authenticity, as I mentioned before. So we have the experts, the people who are experiencing their personal stories as it relates to these issues. But we don't just say, okay, here's a camera, good luck. I hope you do well in your first video you've ever made. Instead, we pair that with professional mentorship. So the folks who work for Rooted in Rights are professional filmmakers, communicators, writers, designers. We provide that mentorship so someone is not out in the jungle alone, that they have backup in our expertise and can be taught the things they need to know, and where they need extra help, we can jump in and provide that support. But they're involved in every step no matter what. So that includes, as I've written here, concept development. So they have a story, they have an idea for what they want to do. We help them frame that, help them sort that out, help them put that into a format that will be accessible to others. We help them with writing the script, with preparing for interviews if they're interviewing people, the actual filming of the piece, the editing and graphics. That tends to fall more heavily on our soldiers because that takes usually a little bit more time to get up to speed on, but in that case, we're still involving people remotely in creative decisions that we make on the piece. Accessibility, so that includes with captioning and audio description for all of our videos, and then distribution. So how are we going to place this out into the world? Who are we going to send this to? That is primarily social media or digital media, but occasionally that is live events, conferences, other things like that. So what do we actually do with these videos? That's a question we get asked all the time. And so I've actually pulled 3 examples for you all to watch. And this is the first one. The one is change a narrative or challenge a perception. I think that's probably true of all the videos that we put out, but some are designed essentially to do that. So the first example I'm going to show you is from Carrie Wade, formerly of Los Angeles, now of Washington, D.C., who did a piece a few months ago. And so let me go ahead and next slide, I'll go ahead and play the video.
NBC News reports.
Now to that historic Supreme Court decision legalizing same-sex marriage across the land, and it's profound.
There is a right to marriage equality. I repeat, speaking to you from the steps of the Supreme Court, there is a right to marriage equality.
Breaking news clip. People wave flags with equal signs.
The 2015 Supreme Court decision in Obergefell v. Hodges marked a huge legal leap forward for LGBTQ people. But what if marriage equality isn't so equal after all?
Outside of City Hall.
I'm Carrie Wade, queer disability rights activist. And for some disabled queer people, getting married still means risking their health, safety, and independence. That's because Social Security assistance programs often come with marriage penalties.
Let's look at the 2 biggest federal assistance programs. Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, provides monthly payments to people with low income and resources who are 65 or older, blind, or disabled. If you qualify for SSI, you typically qualify for Medicaid too. Social Security Disability Insurance, or SSDI, is based on work history instead of income. You start receiving Medicare after you've been getting SSDI for 2 years. So there are some key differences between these programs, but in both cases, marriage changes your benefit amount. SSI benefits are cut based on your spouse's income, and if you receive SSDI through the Adult Disabled Child Program, your benefits are cut off entirely if you marry someone who's working. That not only translates to loss of income, but potentially healthcare services too, all because you decided to get married.
So for queer people on these programs, marriage doesn't necessarily mean equality. In fact, some still can't discuss their relationships publicly, even if they're not yet married, for fear of losing access to benefits. That's the situation for Dominic. He's a queer trans person who's been with his girlfriend for 15 years.
And he agreed to talk with me online using only his first name.
The penalty for me is I choose between, do I get married or do I keep these life-saving healthcare services I need? Because if I don't have those, I don't get out of bed, I don't go to the bathroom, I don't eat, I can't work. It's also limiting because Social Security is now asking disabled people if they're living as though they are married. So that for me has been really hard because I sometimes can't even admit that we're together.
How has your girlfriend negotiated that, and how does she feel about it? I assume you guys have had a lot of conversations about this.
She doesn't mention me, you know? We don't talk about it because I don't think we want to have to go there.
Obergefell promises equal dignity in the eyes of the law, but marriage penalties mean that might not be a reality for disabled people and our partners.
It's the difference between do I live or do I get married? If that's not a fight for equality, I don't know what is.
To help get the word out about these penalties, please share this video in all the ways you can. And visit rootedinrights.org/didlovewin for more information and ways to get involved. Written and directed by Carrie Wade. This video was produced through the Disability Rights Storytellers Fellowship from AAPD and Rooted in Rights with generous support from Time Warner.
So I'm not going to make you watch all the credits for all of these, but that's one example of a video in which we were specifically trying to challenge a narrative. In that case, that the fight for marriage equality is over. In fact, it's continuing for the disability community, and we thought that was a really important video to put out, and we'll keep putting it out every time it becomes relevant to the news cycle. So the next thing we do, and this is something, again, that is really often a feature of everything that we do, is that we connect a human story to a larger systemic issue. As Ashley mentioned, the face of a human is really the most compelling thing you can put into a story, and with video, that's a really powerful thing that video can do better than just about any other form. So in this case, we have a storyteller from Rochester, New York, who tells his personal story as it relates to a very big challenge facing the disability community nationwide.
My name is Jensen Caraballo, and I am a proud 26-year-old person with a disability. I was born with spinal muscular atrophy type 2, which is a neuromuscular disability that affects my muscles. When I was 15 years old, I was forced to live in an institution. I was told I'd only have to be there a month. I ended up living there 5 years, 10 months, and 5 days. I was in the foster care system at the time, and they decided to place me in a nursing home, even though I didn't want to be there. I remember the first day I moved into the facility like it was yesterday. It was the day after Halloween in 2005. All I had was a box and nothing else. I just sat in my room for hours, not knowing what to say or do. All I kept thinking to myself was, I can't wait to get out of here. A month had passed, and there was no sign of me getting out. I was completely discouraged, especially after meeting some of the residents that had been there for years. I met people who were institutionalized for decades. Some people were there for 30 years or more. There were even babies and toddlers living there. Most of the people I met ended up dying at the nursing home. According to a report by the Technical Assistance Collaborative, more than 200,000 non-elderly people with disabilities in the U.S. currently reside in nursing facilities. This is what I was surrounded by, and it terrified me. I didn't want to live out the rest of my life in an institution, but this is the message that was constantly being portrayed to me. I was able to go to high school while I was institutionalized. My aide would get me up and ready every morning, and the bus would pick me up at the facility. But living in an institution isn't something that I wanted to share with many people in school. How do you explain to people that you have to live in a nursing home? In 2009, when I was 18, I graduated from high school and for the first time realized I had other living options after talking to a friend of mine that worked at the Center for Disability Rights. That's when I decided to fight for my freedom. CDR supported me throughout the entire transition. I regained my freedom after 2,135 days of being institutionalized. I now live in my very own apartment. I make my own decisions. I pay my own bills. I do my own thing. Yet my fight is far from over. Our fight is far from over. With the help of activists of yesterday, today, and tomorrow, we can create a world where people with disabilities are free. But it's important our country listens to our stories. Hear our cries for freedom. Join us as allies in the independent living and disability rights movements. Written and directed by Jensen Caraballo. Special thanks to Chris Wood, Maria Costa, Joe Stone, Tim.
So videos like that, Jensen is someone who presents around the country, really around the world these days, and often uses that video as a way to introduce the subjects that he's talking about. Several of our storytellers do that, and others who are not our storytellers use the videos for that as well. So they can be really great ways to get people up on issues they may not be familiar with. And my last example is what we really hope for with a lot of the work that we do, pardon me, especially online, is that we want real-world impact. We want things to change in the real world in a way that we can measure and note and use as a success for future activity. So this is one great example of how that happened. So this storyteller is from Berkeley, California, and I'll let him take it away.
Alex Guinness from a balcony on a bright sunny day.
Hi, my name is Alex Guinness, and I'm a disability rights advocate here in Berkeley, California.
Shots of the city of Berkeley and UC campus.
Did you know that Berkeley is the home of the modern independent living movement? In this college town, a man named Ed Roberts started fighting for the independence and empowerment of people with disabilities back in the 1960s.
Black and white photo of Ed Roberts smiling while reading a book in an iron lung.
When Ed Roberts started living on campus, a whole crew of people with disabilities came along.
Photo of Ed with disabled student colleagues.
The situation grew and transformed into the campus's Disabled Students Residence Program, or DSRP.
Unfortunately, the university is closing the DSRP due to budget cuts and more.
My name's Lisa Albertson. I am an undergraduate transfer student, and in 2015 I founded and started the Berkeley Disabled Students Group in reaction to the disability crisis on campus.
Shots of students with mixed abilities on Berkeley's campus.
We want the university to make disability a priority and quit using the statements that this is where the independent living movement was birthed, the disability rights movement, when on the other hand they're eliminating disabled students' programs and services left and right.
Shot of protesters at UC Berkeley.
Since our protests were gaining momentum, more students and allies are coming out to support, and we're going to take that and run with it. We've learned that this is the only way to get the university's attention and make them do what they're supposed to do, provide us with our accommodations and services so that we could be successful and graduate.
To keep the DSRP alive, go to rootedinrights.org/SaveDSRP and sign on to the petition. You can also consider opening a residence program at your university. Thank you for fighting for independent living. For more videos from storytellers like me, check out rootedinrights.org, and to find out how you can help support this storyteller series,
there's some advertising for us there at the end that I'll skip over. So the good news on that one is last I heard, they were actually able to restore funding for the resource center at the campus, which is obviously the outcome that we're hoping for. And it's important always to say that, of course, the video didn't do that on its own. The people who are working on the ground in Berkeley did the bulk of the work, but where we can add capacity is good video storytelling, good social media campaigning, things that can augment what's happening in the real world. And we love it, of course, when it's successful. So that's a really great story from there as well. And the Storyteller series continues. We should have 3 more coming up in the next couple of months from all around the country. So one thing I want to turn to before I close is there is a handout included in the materials in which I very, very briefly summarize some of the things you can think about in your form of storytelling to follow some of the same methods that we do. And so basically 4 questions that you can ask yourself as you're going through the process. One, is the story told respectfully? And what I mean by that is people are opening up and telling things about themselves, sometimes unpleasant things that have happened to them. So you're going to then use that story to achieve some kind of goal out in the world. You need to partner with the person telling the story on what that goal is. They need to be a part of that conversation so that they feel that their story is being used in the way that they want it to be used. Too often, in a lot of traditional storytelling like this, it's sort of like the organization gets the story and then they just use it however they want to, and that's the end of it. This needs to be more of a two-way street. The second question is the story told authentically. And so that's what I mean by that is centering the storyteller's perspective. It is tempting when you're collaborating with anybody to put in your ideas, make suggestions, help in the exchange of ideas. What you have to be careful about is that you don't insert yourself, meaning you or other people on your staff or others who may have great ideas, but if those ideas infect the story with something that is not authentic to where it came from, what's the point? You're starting to push the original story out of the way, and the whole point of this is to get at that authentic core. So you kind of have to watch yourself and make sure that you're not starting to direct the thing yourself. And that is relevant no matter what medium you're talking about, whether it's a presentation or a video or a written piece. That can be true for any of that. The third one is, will the audience get it? And this is an interesting one. because you, as the professional communicator in your case, you have to be an advocate for the audience too, because the upside of having someone tell their own story is they know it better than anybody. The sort of downside is that it is from their perspective. It is somewhat esoteric by nature. So you have to be the person to say, will people really understand what you're talking about? So that can be explaining lingo, something as simple as that, or acronyms that some people are used to and others are not. Making sure the story comes out maybe chronologically so it's easy for others to follow who may not know all the ins and outs. Making sure that characters who come up in the story are explained who they are and what the relationship is to the main character, something that people who live the story may not think about because it's just kind of, they know this already. It's part of their normal day-to-day. So you can be an advocate for the audience to use plain, accessible language that others are going to be able to understand. And then the last question is something that we at Rooted in Rights have been thinking a lot more about recently, which is how can the storytelling continue? So you make, in our case, a video. It becomes a single deliverable. That video goes out to the world on social media. We've now been thinking more about, like, what else can we do? And so we've been, for example, we started to host events in which we play the videos for live audiences and invite the storytellers either in person or via video chat to interact with that audience. We just did one in Seattle about a month or so ago. And that was an opportunity for the videos to be the jumping off point, but then for the storyteller to continue to tell that story. What's happening now? What more can be done? What's the update? What else is going on? And for audiences to continue to learn about these issues, that they're not just done with it in that 2 or 3 minute bite-sized piece that we've produced for them. And so in other people's cases, this could be any number of things, in a way in which the storyteller continues to be a part of the advocacy going forward.
This is your moderator, Jay, once again. Thank you so much, Jordan and Ashley and Aparna, for all of that knowledge. You've certainly given me a lot to think about in terms of how we work with clients and people that receive services in terms of telling the story of our work. We have a lot of time for questions, which is great because we have a lot of expertise in this room, and we're here for people to take advantage of that. So I encourage you to use the chat, the group chat function, or the Q&A function on your webinar, and ask any questions you might have. I'll give folks just a minute to think of something, and I've got a few backup questions in case we need to get the juices flowing. Okay, great. We've got our first question came in from Adriana, and the question is, video storytelling is powerful but potentially intimidating, especially on a small budget and with little production experience on staff. So what are some small steps that we can take to head in the right direction? Are there any other resources out there that can help us learn the ropes? Jordan, I think you're probably the best suited to take that away initially.
Seems that way.
Yeah.
So I actually get this question a lot, and I can take it in pieces. So are there resources out there? Yes, there's tons, almost endless resources out there for free on the internet that can teach you individual aspects of filmmaking with your phone. So that means filming, editing, and the rest. But what I would encourage you to think about is that the storytelling videos we make, at Rooted in Rights are by professional video makers. That's what everyone who is on staff has been trained in, so that's why our videos exist in the format that they do. But video storytelling need not be high production value either. Part of the beauty of what's happened in the democratization of filmmaking and social media is that people can go live and speak directly to camera just holding their phone, and people will engage with that. I encourage you to experiment with that. If someone has a good story to tell, they can do that via social and digital without necessarily all the bells and whistles that we put into our videos. So I would definitely encourage you to start there. The other thing to do is sometimes if you're on a small budget and you're not going to be able to bring in a production house to pay a production house to make something, you can always partner with people that do. There are nonprofit video production houses out there. We're one of them. We focus on disability rights, but there are others. I also encourage you, or all people working in, especially the nonprofit world, to partner with universities and others. Many colleges have digital filmmaking programs at this point. You're going to get very enthusiastic people who are going to want to do a good job, and it's a great way for them to build portfolio. I can say that some of the way that I got started doing this type of work was by volunteering. In my case, it was a local Red Cross chapter, but it could have been anybody. And so I really, I think that's a really great way to go, because it's a wonderful way to build partnership, keep costs down, of course, and to give someone a shot at doing something important.
Thanks, Jordan. Ashley or Aparna, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Well, I'll just make a plug for a lot of the amazing youth organizations in Seattle that have video programs. These are high school students that, bring an incredible equity lens. Organizations like Real Girls and Youth in Focus are doing storytelling through video and doing it at low or no cost to their clients, which could be your organization.
We've had a few more questions come in, so I'm just going to take them as they come. So can you please review confidentiality requirements for clients? For example, telling stories with details and names changed, etc.
Well, I know from a journalism perspective, you can always make the argument that the name should be changed or just excluded. It always comes down to, making sure that the journalist and, of course, then their editor is confident in the information and kind of that they know who the person is. But oftentimes when it comes to domestic violence situations, when it comes to things that, people would just prefer their names not be attached to for personal or professional reasons, it's certainly not uncommon. You just have to talk to the journalist about it.
We run into that occasionally too. In our case, it has to do a lot of times with safety. And I mean that personal safety, but I also mean that, like the example from the video we just watched, where we had an individual who wanted to speak to us about the issue but didn't want to threaten their benefits. And so we kept that person as anonymous as they wanted to be. So I think a lot of it has to do with some thoughtful thinking, some thoughtfulness about the person's situation and asking, whether they're interview subjects or hosts in our case.
Yeah, and I would say, beyond ethics, just going back to the question of, who is this for, is really important, and that might help you get to how to share pertinent information without putting anybody in danger.
Great, and we just had a question come in that seems like it's along the same lines. Should organizations get signed releases from people for videos?
Yes.
Excellent.
And how often? Is it 100% all the time?
All the time. Yeah, the only exceptions that you might be able to make is so you're out at Pike Place Market and you're shooting some B-roll pipe levelers and a bunch of people walk by, or in a grocery store or something like that, that's different. But certainly if someone's talking on camera and speaking to camera, you're interviewing them all the time. There's no good reason not to do it.
Jordan, I'm actually going to ask a follow-up question to that piece around signed releases, because so many of the legal aid organizations in Washington are actually working with clients that may not speak English as their first language, which, we all speak English. What is, yours and Ashley's recommendations to organizations that are trying to get releases signed by people who don't speak English, and how do you ensure that they understand what they're signing off on?
No, that's a good question. To solve the first problem of how they have access to it in the first place, in our case, our release forms are printed in English, printed in large print for people who may have low vision, and printed in Braille for people who use Braille. And we also have Spanish versions translated ahead of time to have in a pinch if we run into somebody and nobody on our staff speaks Spanish. The real answer to that is making absolutely certain ahead of time you know who you're speaking with so you can prepare adequately. And a lot of times you can send that material ahead of time, and so if people have questions, it's something you can deal with rather than at the moment. But we try to be a bit more proactive in having this is learned through experience too. Having these things. My colleague Rachel is actually in the room with me right now. She just put together these great away kits for us that have all of the different release forms and all the different formats, so that our producers, when they're out in the field, they hopefully will not be in that situation. And if they are, then we need to follow with that person afterwards and make sure that everything is above board.
So we don't really deal in video. I think it would crash our website if we just talked to it like that. But we do take a lot of photos out on the street. Just basic journalistic practice, photos that are taken from any public location you don't necessarily require things to be signed off on. That doesn't mean you shouldn't ask. So we don't deal in a lot of signed releases. What we do, though, is deal with groups that themselves, they're offering us people to talk to. Or say I went to the Millionaires Club the other day, and I'm going to a homeless street soccer practice on Thursday. There are some folks that have, in advance expressed to me they do not want their photo taken, so we're not going to take it. And then organizations like the Millionaires Club, they do have kind of like occasionally signed releases and things like that, or people who have gone to them in advance and said, you've invited a journalist in here, this is how I want to deal with the situation. So our organization is usually on the receiving end of it, being like, oh, okay, you've chosen to talk to us, or this is who you shouldn't speak to or shouldn't photograph.
Great. We have a bunch of different questions coming in on both the Q&A and the group chat. So this next one, again, just kind of trying to take them in order. Looks like it's about homelessness, so it might be for you, Ashley. The participant says, there must be many fascinating stories arising from Seattle's homelessness community. My impression is that there are some who work but just can't afford rent. Others are mentally ill, and others who have just decided they like the life of homelessness. Do you have data on who these people are and why they're homeless? Do you tell stories from all of the groups equally to inform your readers/watchers of the nature of the homelessness problem? Would all of these stories be equally interesting to the public?
That's a really interesting question. So as you might imagine, data on people who are experiencing homelessness is patchy at best. Service providers have access to far better data than I do because they have access to the HMIS system, the Homeless Management Information System. There are surveys that are done. Some of them are, I would say a little bit out of date. What I can tell you based on, constant discussion with service providers, certainly talking to the group of vendors that I work with and folks who live in sanctioned and unsanctioned homeless encampments, you would be surprised. Many people out there are, of course, experiencing some form of mental illness. There are some kind of basic survey data that come out when the one-night count us in numbers, as it's called now, when they're released, which should be somewhere around the end of the month. So they'll take some information. That's obviously self-selecting and voluntary, so you never know exactly what you're getting, but it is the best data that we have. Many homeless people do work and can't rent. Some people got a little bit behind and then found themselves with an eviction. Now it's almost impossible for them to rent in as hot of a housing market. Some folks absolutely can't participate in the workplace environment, or not a traditional one, and that keeps them connected to social services, and they don't have better options because we are very much invested in the emergency side of things rather than being able to really address the kind of housing first model that people are hoping, so they can just plug those folks into an apartment and then help them work through everything else. What I will say is that I have certainly heard of and occasionally met folks who just decide to live outside. That is exceptionally rare, and it gets a lot more rare as they get older. I heard a story about a gentleman who lived outside of the system and then couldn't get back in because he didn't even have a birth certificate, so he couldn't get ID, so he couldn't participate in shelter programs. So I think that the folks who have found it freeing at one point may not as they hit 50. But yeah, so certainly we try to tell all of these stories and just give people windows into the lives of folks that are experiencing homelessness. I have no idea if they all find it interesting.
Thank you, Ashley. We have a question from someone about volunteers helping to tell the story of legal services. So as you likely know, a lot of the legal aid programs around the state rely heavily on private attorneys donating hours, doing pro bono work to help people who need legal services. So the question is, can the speakers give any specific tips on how volunteers might help tell their stories about why they volunteer, which could include info about working with specific clients, and perhaps how service providers can coach those volunteers to tell stories ethically, inclusively, compassionately, etc.
They should probably take a look at this presentation. But I think it's great if you have volunteers who want to talk about that. There's no better way to persuade more people to volunteer than to have the stories of people who have had a good experience or interesting experience volunteering. I think that the approach should be very similar to what we talked about here, where you want to empower that person to tell their own story, but you also want to mentor them so that they can tell that story in a way that's going to be in line with the messaging of the organization, of course, and speaks to the mission of the organization. But I think a lot of what we talked about here is really applicable in that situation, whether that storytelling is video or written or otherwise.
I mean, I would say that, a best practice for any organization is do a really solid orientation with volunteers, even if they are highly educated, white-collar workers like attorneys are, set the ground rules. In my presentation, I shared a little bit about values and fluency of language. So those are things that, come into play and can be established right at the beginning. And, it's amazing. Volunteers should tell stories, and they should actually share about why they're involved with legal aid organizations. We need the volunteers, especially attorneys representing clients. We also need to let our community know what issues are, what are the issues. And so, great, do good orientation.
Real change couldn't exist without the really dedicated and wonderful volunteers that help our organization at every level that you can imagine. We have volunteer writers. We have volunteers who work the front desk. We have volunteers who teach writing to some of our vendors. And absolutely what Aparna says, we have a very solid orientation that's done by our amazing volunteer manager that we've actually just gone through and revisited. She updated it relatively recently to include especially race and equity as part of the discussion, so that people are brought up to speed on some of the potential issues that they could be facing. I think that the orientation, as Aparna said, is really, really critical.
And I have a follow-up question to that. One of the things that I took from all three of you is the importance of working to center the story on the individual who's telling it or impacted. Not necessarily coming in as an organization from the standpoint of, we helped save this person, or this is kind of this quote-unquote broken person that we lifted up. Is it fair to say, and this is kind of leading, is it fair to say that to encourage people to do the same thing with volunteers, so to get volunteers to center themselves in how they tell their story, not so much telling the story of, oh, this is a client that I worked with, but really they're centering their experience and what it's like to volunteer? I'm seeing nodding heads, so. I would say both. I mean, there are moments where I think it is absolutely critical that we center our clients in storytelling, and then there are going to be times where
an organization wants to center its volunteers and the time they give. And I think that really, I'm not an expert necessarily on storytelling, but I suspect that, you know, based on the audience, you will center differently. And we have like 2 expert storytellers here that can probably talk a little bit more about, you know, developing a story for an audience.
I mean, I think the question then becomes, what's the goal? Are you trying to get more volunteers? Is this one volunteer, have they worked so closely with, you know, a certain population or group that they can speak to it more fluently than, or, you know, more humanly than maybe another person in the organization? I think you would have to be careful in that second circumstance. But yeah, definitely if you're trying to get more volunteers, who's better than a volunteer to tell you?
Okay, moving on. One of our participants said, we frequently use stock photos next to stories of clients to protect the confidentiality of our clients who often have an active case. We don't want to jeopardize their case. What are your thoughts on this?
I know I'm taking up a lot of time. It's just, you have to be careful. You have to be careful that you're not putting any particular, you know, race, code, or creed in a negative light, that the case is something that makes sense to have the photo with, as I'm sure that, you know, you already know. You just want to be very sure, and maybe run it by somebody in the community, either, you know, a person from a specific religion or a person of that particular ethnic background, and just make sure that, you know, when you put that photo out there, you're not painting a group with a brush that you don't intend to.
Yeah, I would second that. And also on the flip side, sometimes you have to worry about the licensing itself when you're using a stock photo. There's often rules about how the model in the photo can be portrayed. So I would definitely look at that before you use it. And in general, I have a very love-hate relationship with stock photos. And for some of the pitfalls that Ashley identified, especially in our case, we are always looking for stock photos of disabled people that are not awful. I mean, I don't know anywhere to say that. And, you know, only the other day I think it was Getty and another organization announced they're doing a whole new series of realistic, authentic stock photos, so that maybe that'll help us. But it's always a problem because stock photos are stock. They're meant to be generic, and so it's hard to use them for something specific without stereotyping.
We have 2 questions about translation. When looking at possibly translating stories, are there things you should always make sure to discuss or think about when debating whether or not to translate? And along with that, are there any other options to translate a video besides subtitles to make sure people who can't read can still understand the video?
I can do the second one. So let me see. Are there any other options to trans? Well, yes. So we'll have situations, let's say, where we'll do an interview with somebody who speaks Spanish. In order to make that video accessible, we audio describe all of our videos, and so that means we say out loud some of the important visuals in the film, and we do that because we want blind and low vision audiences to be able to understand what's going on. So if someone's speaking Spanish and someone cannot see our English subtitles that we would put there, we audio describe their voice as well. So that means dubbing. So if you have someone who speaks Spanish in a video, we will dub over that with someone who speaks English. We do that for accessibility purposes. That would also, of course, help someone who can't read English as well. That would be my suggestion in terms of how to go about doing that.
Admittedly, Real Change doesn't do much in the way of translation for our newspaper, which is, I mean, a limitation for us, for sure.
There is an organization called Translators Without Borders, and I have used them in the past when I've lived overseas. And, you know, I mean, they have volunteers from around the world who speak a lot of different languages. And in the state of Washington, you know, I suspect that it's dozens of different languages that are written and spoken by our clients. And as somebody who doesn't speak English as my native language, I know that, you know, in storytelling, when you're translating, it's really, really important to have somebody who's as close a native speaker to help you with that translation so that you're not just translating verbatim, but you really are translating the feel of the story and the content of the story. So when possible, I would say find a native speaker to double check your translation, but also know that there are so many incredible free resources now that can help with that.
Great, and I think the last question we have in the hopper is good information on storytelling for print journalism and video platform. Are there tips for social media where a viewer needs a quick, sharp takeaway? And before I let our panelists jump in to talk about tips for social media, I just want to mention that so this webinar is being hosted by the Access to Justice Board's Communications Committee. We're doing a quarterly webinar series this year. This is the second of 4 webinars, and in September, on September 26th, we're going to be putting on a webinar, Best Practices for Social Media. So we'll dive into much more detail on that, and you can always go to the Alliance for Equal Justice website, allianceforequaljustice.org, to learn more about upcoming webinars, and all of the materials, the PowerPoints, the actual recording from all of our webinars are also on that website, so you can refer back to them and have access to them, or forward them to your staff to watch at a later date. So back to the question, do folks have tips for social media that they'd like to share?
I find social media deeply terrifying. I only got on Twitter in any real capacity because of this job. I don't know. From that perspective, I would just say be very careful. Read over it multiple times. Use that new Twitter thread feature. It's lovely and just lets you kind of maybe take the time. But yeah, you can misstep on social media so easily.
I'm less terrified of it. It's a way that we can reach people in ways, whereas 10 years ago we wouldn't be able to. We just wouldn't be able to. So I think it's incredibly powerful with all of the caveats about how dangerous it can be in the wrong hands, of course. But back to the question of sort of tips for social media for short takeaways. I mean, there's kind of 2 schools of thought on this. I think some people over-message a lot of the stuff on social media, and so they become carbon copies of things you might put in a press release or even web copy. Social media, to me, is meant to be more casual. That's its power, is that you have to, most of the time, you should feel as though a update coming from a page, meaning so a company or organization, like in our case, you should feel like it's coming from a human, another human being who's sitting behind that computer looking out for you. So in our case, we post stories about disability rights from around the world, and so we want our digital manager to be that person out there looking for those interesting stories, curating them, providing them for our audience, and throwing in a little comment to help them understand what's going on. That can also be in the form of updates. I don't know if anybody's really doing breaking news, but like big announcements maybe is a better way of putting that. I also always think that short takeaways are the power of a Facebook share text or a tweet or something like that, but always give people the option to go deeper. So very rarely will you see us put out just a piece of text on social media. We almost always have a link or a video or a photo or something else with it. So it's, here's the short little bit, here's the catchy headline to get you up to speed quickly. If you want to learn more, here's more. If you want to watch a video, here's the video. If you want to read an article, here's an article. Because really it becomes that funnel to get people to other content that might be important to them that they might need to know. So I would think about it that way, casual, feel like a human being wrote it, invite that human being to learn more about whatever's going on.
Jordan, how do you keep it from being that sensationalist 140 or how many ever characters Twitter is now, right? Because I think Ashley had a slide where she had an example. It says, Ballard residents ask how rape could have been prevented. And it feels so sensationalist. It's like, well, is that really the headline? How do you manage that?
we talk about it a lot, and we actually brainstorm headlines in social share text on purpose to try to avoid that problem. Because the one end of the spectrum is just boring text that everybody's going to scroll past. The other end of the spectrum is clickbait. And we don't want clickbait. Clickbait is setting expectations high and then not delivering. So the most amazing video you've ever seen, and then they click and it's not the most amazing video they've ever seen. So that's for people who are trying to make money off of clicks. We're not trying to do that anyway. Plus, we actually like our audience and want them to stick around. So we don't want to do that. So steering away from sensation, I think it's helpful to have more than one person thinking about it. So, but also not being afraid to be catchy, because headlines are headlines for a reason. They're there to bring people's interest in, and this goes back fundamentals of newspapers for centuries. You know, you put the headline on there on purpose to give people a sense of what the story is, because you're inviting them to read the next line, and so that's what really you should be thinking about. That headline shouldn't overpromise. It should exactly promise what's about to happen, and then you can get more involved when you get into it. So we think about that in terms of social share text, and also literally headlines, because we also run a blog. And so we want to make sure that the blogs are attracting readership as well. And so we do some deliberate thinking about that, brainstorming, to make sure that we are perfectly on that spectrum.
Amazing, thank you.
Great, it looks like we have one more question that just came in. And so after I read this, I'm just going to invite each of you to share any kind of last thoughts that you have before we sign off for the day. So one of our participants asked, for smaller programs without dedicated communications staff, are there solid resources that are free/low cost and user-friendly, i.e. The consumer is not a communications professional?
Yeah, we touched on it briefly earlier, at least from the video point of view, but I think there's sort of endless resources out there these days. People are very willing to put out sort of how-tos on writing good social media posts, writing good blogs, making videos, writing stories. I can't vouch for the quality of all of them, but there's plenty out there for you to sift through. This is actually making me think we should develop a go-to list for this kind of thing. But I found that there's a social media network called LinkedIn, Ashley, and on LinkedIn there's a lot of people who offer those tips actually quite a bit, and they're not all just self-promotional things. They're actually super helpful sometimes. So in our case, some of our vendors have blogs, and they put out blogs on this. So our vendor for music, for stock music, our vendor for captioning puts out webinars and blogs that can actually help with this, because a lot of times those companies want you to care about this because they then want to go ahead and sell your product later on. But along the way, they're willing to teach you a few things. So I think there are quite a bit out there if you can Google around a bit.
You've gotten some excitement about a go-to list.
Yeah, I also think that Ashley's handouts and my handouts that are part of the webinar resources have tons and tons of resources. I would say, leverage your LinkedIn network and or your Facebook network and say, hey, who can help me with X, Y, and Z? And there are lots of people who are looking to get involved. I mean, going back to that question about volunteers and the role of volunteers in organizations, there are lots of people who have the time and want to give it in a way that's meaningful. And so why not? You know, I mean, it's a little bit of ask and you shall receive. And yeah.
Okay, well, thank you to all of our panelists, and thanks to everyone who joined us today. You should have Aparna's and Ashley's and Jordan's emails on your screen in front of you, so if you have questions, don't be shy. And again, you can give us a little bit of time, but you'll be able to find all of the materials and resources and recording from this webinar at www.allianceforequaljustice.org. Thanks again, everyone.